The Wyoming sky was a brutal, beautiful thing. It stretched from one jagged horizon to the other, a canvas of impossible blue so vast it could make a man feel like a king or an ant, sometimes both in the same breath. Below it, the land was no softer. Snow clung to the high, granite peaks of the Bighorns, even in the warmer months, a constant reminder of the winter that was always waiting. Down in the basin, endless flats of gray-green sagebrush rolled on forever, their dusty scent baked into the air by a sun that offered light but little warmth. It was a land of harsh edges and profound silence, utterly indifferent to the sweat and blood of the men who tried to tame it. Elias Thorne understood the land's indifference. He felt a kinship with it. For 5 years, it had been his only real companion, its silence a welcome substitute for the noise that lived inside his head. He stood now, a solitary figure against the immensity, working the fence line of his isolated ranch. At 35, he looked a decade older. The sun had carved deep lines into the tanned leather of his face, and his hands, thick with calluses, were tools that had long forgotten the meaning of a soft touch. He moved with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. Not a step, not a breath. He pulled the wire taut with a grunt, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling like thick rope. The rhythmic creak of the stretcher and the sharp rap of his hammer against the staples were the only sounds to break the whisper of the wind through the sage. He worked from the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of light were devoured by the mountains. The grueling labor was a penance and a prayer, the only thing that could quiet the ghosts. But sometimes they broke through. The scent of the dry wood of the fence post, baking in the afternoon sun, was all it took. Suddenly, it was not sage on the wind, but smoke, acrid, choking smoke that burned his eyes and stole the air from his lungs. The sharp crack of a staple-splitting wood became the splintering of a cabin door. A woman's scream, high and thin, sliced through the memory, followed by the deeper roar of rough male laughter, and beneath it all, a sound that broke him every time it returned, the ghost of a little boy's giggle, happy and innocent, from a time just hours before the world had ended. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white on the handle of the hammer. Sarah, Daniel. The names were a silent prayer, a curse, a wound that would not close. He had been checking the far pasture, had heard the shots too late. By the time he got back, all that was left was the fire, a ravenous orange beast consuming his life, and a silence where laughter used to be. He had failed them. He was supposed to be their protector, and he had failed. The thought was a brand on his soul. He opened his eyes, the vast, empty landscape coming back into focus. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the smoke of memory receding, and hammered another staple into the post with 3 sharp, violent blows. His bay gelding, Apollo, stood patiently nearby. Reins looped over a sturdy branch. When the work was done for the day, Elias approached the horse, and the hard lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. His calloused hands, which could wrestle a steer to the ground, were impossibly gentle as he ran them down the horse's flank and adjusted the saddle blanket. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rasp, gravelly from disuse. It was one of the few living things he allowed himself to touch with anything approaching tenderness. The next morning, he rode into Redemption Creek. The town was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a fragile outpost of civilization clinging to life by a thread. It was a place built on contradictions. At the east end of town stood the First Baptist Church, its white paint peeling but its steeple sharp and accusatory against the blue sky. At the west end sat the saloon, the Dust Devil, its bat-wing doors swinging with a promise of a different kind of salvation. In between lay a collection of false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a blacksmith, a sheriff's office, and a handful of houses, all huddled together as if for warmth against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. The people of Redemption Creek were much like their town, raw, weathered, and built on a foundation of quiet desperation and harsh piety. They were survivors, their face etched with the hardships of drought, blizzard, and loneliness. They were wary of strangers and even warier of each other, their judgment as sharp and unforgiving as a winter wind. They knew Ellis Thorne. They respected his ability to pull a living from a harsh patch of land that had broken lesser men. They saw the way he handled his horse, the straightness of his fence lines, the quality of the cattle he occasionally sold. But they did not know the man. He was a shadow who appeared in town for supplies and then vanished back into the sagebrush hills. He tipped his hat, but did not smile. He answered questions directly but offered no conversation. He attended no church services, sat on no town committees, and never once set foot inside the Dust Devil. He was a solitary island, and the town, for the most part, was content to leave him be. As he tied Apollo to the hitching post outside the Mercantile, he saw her, Clara May Thompson. She was walking down the opposite side of the street, a small wicker basket held tight against her stomach. He knew of her, as everyone in Redemption Creek did. He had heard the whispers. He saw the way the other women, Mrs. Gable from the bakery and Mrs. Henderson, the rancher's wife, stopped their conversation as she approached, their eyes turning to ice. He watched them turn their backs, presenting her with a wall of calico-covered scorn. Clara May Thompson did not flinch. She kept walking, her gaze fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet. She was young, maybe 22, but she moved with the heavy weariness of an old woman. Her brown dress was faded from too many washings, but was immaculately clean and mended with neat, tiny stitches. Her shoulders were hunched, a permanent defense against the weight of the town's contempt. She was the town pariah. A year ago, her husband, Jedediah Thompson, a man known for his brutish temper and heavy hand, had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine on their property. The official story was that he had slipped and fallen while drunk, but rumor, a weed that grew fast and thick in the soil of Redemption Creek, told a different tale. The whispers, fanned by the town's most pious figures, suggested that Clara had a hand in it. She had shown no tears at the funeral, had worn no black for more than a month. Her stoic silence in the face of widowhood was twisted into a confession of guilt, proof of a cold and sinful nature. She was a fallen woman, a stain on the town's fragile sense of decency. Elias watched her disappear into the Mercantile, the town's collective sneer following her like a stray dog. He felt a familiar annoyance stir in his gut. He had no time for town gossip, for the petty cruelties people used to make themselves feel righteous. He finished tying his knot and crossed the dusty street. The bell above the door of Miller's Mercantile jingled softly as he entered. The air inside was a comforting mix of scents, coffee beans and cured tobacco, leather harnesses and sharp cheddar, molasses and fresh sawn pine. Mr. Miller, a balding man with a perpetually worried expression, gave Elias a curt nod from behind the counter. Clara was near the back of the store, by the bolts of fabric, her back to the room. She was examining a spool of thread, her movements small and hesitant, as if she were afraid of drawing attention to herself. But it was too late for that. A knot of women had gathered near the front, their voices low but carrying in the quiet store. Leading them was Martha Albright, the preacher's wife, a woman whose face was set in a permanent state of pinched disapproval. "It is a disgrace that she still shows her face in this town," Mrs. Albright declared, her voice dripping with sanctimony. "A woman of her character, living all alone out there. It is an invitation to sin." "An unnatural woman," another chimed in, "to not even mourn her own husband." Clara stood frozen, her hand hovering over the spools of thread. Her shoulders, already hunched, seemed to curl in even further. She wanted to be invisible, to melt into the rough-hewn wooden walls. Elias moved to the back of the store, pretending to inspect a display of new axes. He kept his head down, wanting no part of this. It was not his business. He had a rule, a code he had lived by for 5 years. Do not get involved. Involvement led to connection, and connection led to pain. He had enough pain to last a dozen lifetimes. But then the women, emboldened by their numbers, moved toward Clara. They formed a half circle around her, blocking her path to the counter. Mrs. Thompson! Mrs. Albright said, her voice now loud enough for everyone, including Mr. Miller, to hear. We feel, for the good of the community, that it is time you moved on. Your presence here is a stain on the good and God-fearing people of Redemption Creek. Clara's face was ashen. She clutched her small basket, her knuckles turning white. It held only a few potatoes and a small bag of cornmeal. She said nothing, her throat working, but no sound came out. A woman who brings about the death of her own husband has no place among decent folk, another woman added, her words sharp as broken glass. That was when something inside Elias snapped. It was the sight of her trapped, cornered like a frightened doe by a pack of coyotes. He recognized the look in her eyes as she finally lifted her head, a desperate, hunted look he knew intimately. It was the look of someone whose world had been stripped away, leaving them alone to face the wolves. He set the axe down with a quiet thud and walked toward the front of the store. He was a large man, and his heavy boots made a slow, deliberate sound on the floorboards. The women fell silent as he approached, their righteous crusade faltering in the face of his imposing, silent presence. He did not look at them. He did not look at Clara. He walked directly to the counter, placing himself squarely between her and her accusers. He looked directly at Martha Albright, his gray eyes as cold and flat as a winter sky. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calm, yet it carried an authority that cut through the tension in the air like a knife. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze unwavering, "the lady is trying to buy her flour." The words were simple, a plain statement of fact, but they were laden with an implicit threat. He was not arguing with them. He was dismissing them. He was drawing a line in the dust, and none of them dared to cross it. "Mrs." Albright's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound emerged. Her face flushed a deep, indignant red. With a huff, she gathered her flock, and they retreated from the store, muttering about insolence and siding with sinners. Elias still did not look at Clara. He placed his own list of supplies on the counter. A sack of oats, Mr. Miller, and some coffee. He paid for his goods, his movements unhurried. He tipped the brim of his hat to the storekeeper, gathered his sack, and walked out of the mercantile without a backward glance. The bell above the door jingled his departure, leaving behind a thick, ringing silence. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trembling, a mix of leftover fear and a strange, new warmth spreading through her chest. In the year since Jedediah's death, not a single person in Redemption Creek had spoken a word in her defense. She had been utterly, completely alone. And now this man, this silent, grieving man whom everyone kept at a distance, had stood for her. He had not offered sympathy or kindness. He had simply offered a shield. She watched through the store's dusty window as he untied his horse, swung himself into the saddle with fluid grace, and rode out of town. He was a solitary figure shrinking against the vast horizon, heading back to the isolation she knew so well. The moment was not romantic. It was raw and real. A small, hard stone of decency dropped into the murky well of her life, and for the first time in a very long time, it gave her a flicker of something other than despair. Her own life was a testament to survival. The cabin Jedediah had left her was small and dilapidated, its timbers groaning with every gust of wind. It sat on a small plot of land that everyone considered worthless, rocky soil that would not grow much more than stubborn weeds. But it had one saving grace, a small creek fed by mountain springs that cut through the back of the property. It was a rare, year-round source of water, a thread of life in a dry land. She survived by taking in laundry and mending from the few souls who valued a bargain more than town gossip, mostly bachelor cowboys and the saloon girls. It was back-breaking work. She hauled water from the creek, her hands raw and chapped from the harsh lye soap. She scrubbed and boiled and hung clothes until her arms ached, her small home constantly smelling of damp fabric and wood smoke. It was a life of grinding poverty, of isolation and a constant, simmering fear of what the future held, or what the town might do next. That future was being discussed in the sheriff's office. Silas Blackwood sat with his boots propped up on Sheriff Brody's desk, swirling amber liquor in a thick glass. Blackwood was the wealthiest man in the valley, a cattle baron who owned a sprawling ranch that dwarfed all the others combined. He presented himself as a pillar of the community, a man who donated generously to the church and spoke of progress and order. But beneath the veneer of civility was a man who ruled by fear and intimidation, a man who saw the world as a collection of things to be acquired. "The Thompson woman is still proving to be an obstacle," Blackwood said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. He took a sip of his whiskey. "I want that land, Brody. My herds need that creek, especially with the dry summer we have had." Sheriff Brody, a man with a weak chin and eyes that never quite met another's gaze, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "She ain't breaking any laws, Silas. She just stays out there." Blackwood smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no warmth. "Laws are for men who cannot make their own. She is a troublesome woman, a blight on this town's reputation. I should think the good people of Redemption Creek would be grateful to see her gone." He looked at Brody, his meaning clear. "Use the town's prejudice. Make her life uncomfortable. A woman alone can only take so much pressure before she breaks. I want her gone, one way or another. See to it." Miles away, back at his own ranch, Elias Thorne unsaddled Apollo and rubbed him down. As he worked, his mind, against his will, drifted back to the mercantile, to the woman with the pale, defiant face and the hunted look in her eyes. He was annoyed with himself. He had broken his own rule. Getting involved was a fool's game. And yet, the image of her stayed with him. He had seen that look before. In the mirror, it was the look of being cornered by a world that did not care, of having everything ripped away and being left with nothing but the will to keep breathing. He had built a fortress of solitude around his heart to protect himself from ever feeling that way again, from ever caring about anyone he could lose. He tried to push the thought away, turning his attention to the familiar evening chores, feeding the chickens, checking on the cattle, splitting wood for the stove. But a crack had appeared in the wall he had so carefully constructed, a small, almost invisible fissure, but it was there. As the sun began to set, he stood on his porch, watching the sky bleed into brilliant shades of orange, purple, and red, the profound, aching loneliness of his existence, a feeling he had long ago accepted as his permanent state, suddenly felt sharper, heavier than it had in a very long time. The vast, indifferent land no longer felt like a comfort, but a cage. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt the ghost of a desire for it to be something else. The weeks that followed bled into one another, each day a little shorter, a little sharper than the one before. Autumn settled over the territory not with gentle grace, but with a harsh, demanding grip. The leaves of the cottonwoods along the distant riverbeds turned a brilliant, fleeting yellow, then withered and fell, leaving skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The air grew a colder edge, and the wind that swept across the sage flats carried the first real threat of winter, a palpable presence that urged every living thing to prepare or perish. Elias Thorne kept to his solitary routine, the rhythm of his chores a familiar bulwark against the chaos of his thoughts. Yet, something had been unsettled in him since that day at the mercantile. The rigid discipline of his solitude had been disturbed. He found himself inventing reasons to ride the southern edge of his property, the boundary that ran closest to Clara Mae Thompson's small, forgotten parcel of land. He told himself he was checking for stray cattle, scouting for better winter grazing, or tracking a rumor of wolves. They were thin excuses, and he knew it. The truth was a magnetic pull he could neither understand nor resist, a subconscious need to know that she was still there, still holding on. From the crest of a low ridge, he could see her small cabin, a lonely smudge against the vast landscape. He watched her from a distance, a silent, unseen observer. He saw her chopping wood, the axe rising and falling with a steady, determined rhythm that seemed impossible for her small frame. He saw her tending to a struggling patch of a garden, her hands working the soil, trying to coax a few more vegetables from the ground before the first frost. He saw the sheer, grinding effort of her survival, and a feeling he had long since buried. A deep, unwilling respect began to stir within him. She was not wilting under the town's scorn. She was fighting. Silas Blackwood was not a patient man. His foreman had reported that the Thompson woman was proving stubborn, and his desire for her land, and the creek that ran through it, had only sharpened with the coming of the dry season. He decided it was time to apply a more direct pressure. One afternoon, a rider approached Clara's cabin. Elias, watching from his usual ridge, recognized the horse and the hulking figure of the man who rode it. It was Caleb, Blackwood's foreman, a man whose reputation for casual cruelty was known throughout the valley. Elias's hand instinctively went to the worn stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He watched, his body tense, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Caleb did not dismount. He sat high on his big roan, looking down at Clara as she emerged from her cabin, wiping her wet hands on an apron. "Afternoon, ma'am," Caleb said, his voice a low drawl that was more sneer than greeting. "Mr. Blackwood sent me. He is a charitable man, and he worries about a woman all alone out here. It is not a safe place." Clara stood straight, her chin lifted. "I manage." Caleb chuckled, a thick, unpleasant sound. "Mr. Blackwood figures this place is too much for you. He would be willing to take it off your hands, pay you a fair, charitable price so you can go back east where you belong." "This is where I belong," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "The land is not for sale." "Everything is for sale, ma'am," Caleb said, his smile tightening. "Sometimes a person just does not realize it yet." He let the threat hang in the air between them. Then, with a deliberate tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse around, guiding the animal directly through the small garden patch she had worked so hard to cultivate. The horse's heavy hooves tore through the rows of carrots and late-season beans, churning the soil and crushing the plants into the dirt. It was a small act, but its meaning was immense. It was a violation, a show of power, a promise of what else he could destroy if he wished. He trotted away without looking back, leaving a trail of casual destruction in his wake. Clara stood staring at the ruined garden, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was terrified, a cold dread seeping into her bones, but she refused to let him see her cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. From the ridge, Elias had seen it all, a hot, dark rage, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in 5 years, surged through him. His every instinct screamed at him to ride down there, to drag Caleb from his horse and teach him a lesson in a language the man would understand. But he held back, his knuckles white on the leather of his reins. He was wrestling with the ghost of his own past, with the hard-learned lesson that involvement meant pain. He had failed to protect his family. What right did he have to protect this woman? He stayed on that ridge until the sun went down, a silent guardian she did not know she had. The sight of Caleb's casual, thoughtless cruelty had stirred something deep inside him, the protective instinct he had tried for so long to kill. It was a fire he thought had burned out, leaving only cold ash. He was wrong. The next morning, he rode to her cabin. The excuse of a lost calf felt flimsy and foolish on his tongue even before he said it. He found her by the fence line, trying to repair a section where Caleb's horse had evidently pushed through. The damaged garden was a sad, ugly scar on the land. "Ma'am," he said as he rode up. He dismounted, keeping a respectful distance. Clara spun around, a small hatchet in her hand, her eyes wide with fear that quickly turned to wary suspicion. She recognized him as the man from the mercantile. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Name is Elias Thorne. I ranch the next valley over," he said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "I was tracking a stray calf. Did not mean to trouble you." She looked at him, her gaze assessing. After a year of relentless hostility, she was suspicious of any interaction that was not openly cruel. She saw no threat in his eyes, but she saw no warmth either. She simply saw a quiet, deep-seated sorrow. "I have not seen any strays," she said, her tone softening slightly. Elias nodded, his eyes falling on the broken fence rail. "Looks like you had some trouble here." "I can manage it," she said quickly, her pride a fragile shield. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the trembling in her hands as she gripped the hatchet. She had been working at it for hours, with little success. He ignored her refusal. He walked to his horse, unstrapped a small tool roll and a length of rope from his saddle, and walked back to the fence. Without another word, he got to work. His movements were efficient and sure. He braced the broken post, set the rail back in place, and began lashing it with a skill that spoke of years of practice. Clara stood watching him, a storm of conflicting emotions warring within her, fear of his motives, suspicion of his kindness, and a profound, reluctant gratitude. She had been so alone for so long, and the simple sight of someone helping, of someone sharing her burden without being asked, was almost too much to bear. He worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the rasp of the rope and the whisper of the wind. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, an acknowledgement of the things that did not need to be said. Finally, when the fence was secure, he turned to her. He looked past the fence to the small stack of firewood piled against her cabin wall. It was not nearly enough to last through a Wyoming winter. "You have enough wood for the season?" he asked. His voice was still low, but the question was direct and practical. The simple query, so devoid of judgment or pity, broke through her defenses. It was a question of survival, from one survivor to another. A lump formed in her throat. She shook her head, unable to speak. "No," she finally managed to whisper. The single word was an admission of defeat, a confession of her own desperate vulnerability. Elias met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than grief in his eyes. It was understanding. "I have plenty of deadfall on my property. I will bring you a load tomorrow." He began to gather his tools, preparing to leave. Before he mounted his horse, he stopped and looked at her, his expression serious. "A man like Caleb," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "A man who serves a bully like Blackwood, only understands one thing, strength. Do not show him you are afraid. He feeds on it." And then he was on his horse, tipping his hat in a brief, almost imperceptible gesture, and riding away. Clara was left standing by her newly mended fence, his words echoing in her mind. He knew. He had seen what happened. He understood the danger she was in, and he had helped her anyway. True to his word. Elias arrived the next day with his wagon loaded high with seasoned pine and aspen. The delivery did not go unnoticed. News of it traveled through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. Elias Thorne, the town's most resolute loner, helping the fallen woman. The whispers intensified. The town's judgment, once focused solely on Clara, now expanded to include him. He was branded as immoral as she, a man of low character seeking sinful company. Elias was utterly indifferent to their gossip. He had lived with the town's judgment for 5 years. Their shifting opinions were as meaningless to him as the direction of the wind. His indifference, however, only fueled their indignation. A week later, the weather turned. An early autumn storm. born in the high peaks, swept down into the basin with sudden and shocking violence. The sky turned a bruised purple gray, and a torrential, freezing rain began to fall. The dry, dusty landscape turned to a sea of greasy, slick mud in a matter of hours. Elias was riding back from a trip to a distant town, a long ride he had taken to avoid Redemption Creek. As he neared the valley where Clara's cabin sat, he saw that the creek, normally a placid ribbon of water, had become a raging brown torrent. It had jumped its banks and was now clawing at the earth around her small home, threatening to wash away a section of the cabin's foundation. He spurred Apollo into a gallop. He found her outside, soaked to the bone and shivering violently in the deluge. She was desperately trying to dig a diversion trench with a small garden shovel, her efforts futile against the rising water. The mud sucked at her boots, and her face was pale with exhaustion and fear. He swung down from his horse before it had even come to a full stop. He did not say a word. He strode over to her, took the shovel from her numb, trembling hands, and began to dig. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, driving the shovel into the sodden earth, heaving aside great clumps of mud and rock. Clara, seeing his determination, grabbed a broken piece of planking and began to help, scraping at the mud, fighting alongside him. They worked together in the pouring, freezing rain, a silent, desperate team battling the storm. The shared struggle created a powerful, raw intimacy. The cold, the mud, the punishing physical exertion stripped away all pretense, all awkwardness. There was only the rising water and their unified effort to stop it. At one point, Clara slipped in the slick mud, her feet going out from under her. Elias dropped the shovel and caught her in an instant, his hands gripping her waist, his body solid and unmovable. He held her steady, preventing her from falling. She was pressed against him, her face upturned to his, the cold rain plastering her hair to her skin and dripping from her chin. In that moment, with the storm raging around them, their eyes met. The world seemed to fall away. He saw not the town pariah, the fallen woman, but a soul of incredible strength and fierce defiance. She saw not the broken, silent rancher, but a man of deep, quiet power and unexpected gentleness. It was a moment charged with an unspoken, undeniable intensity. They were not two lonely outcasts. They were two survivors, fighting the same storm. He helped her to her feet, and they went back to work, the unspoken energy of that moment fueling them. Just as dusk began to fall, turning the gray world to black, the trench was finished, the bulk of the floodwater diverted, flowing harmlessly past the cabin. They had won. Exhausted, freezing, and covered in mud, they stumbled toward the cabin. Elias helped her inside, his hand firm on her arm. The interior was sparse, almost bare, but it was immaculately clean, a testament to her desperate hold on her own dignity. A small fire was struggling in the stone hearth. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, his voice rough. He turned his back to give her privacy while he worked on building up the fire, his practical nature taking over. She changed into a dry, worn dress behind a thin curtain, her body shaking uncontrollably. When she emerged, he had the fire roaring, its warmth a welcome blessing. "The storm is not letting up," he said, looking out the small, grimy window. "I will stay until I am sure the creek has crested." It was a statement, not a request. She nodded, too tired to argue. She went to her small pantry and took out the last of her vegetables and a small piece of salted pork. She offered him the only food she had, a thin stew. They ate in near silence, sitting on the floor before the fire, the only sounds the howl of the wind outside and the crackle of the flames. The shared meal in the warmth of the cabin felt more intimate than any conversation. When they were finished, she found the courage to speak. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She took a deep breath. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" He was silent for a long time. so long that she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of shadows and light, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with a pain she could not understand. "I do not hold with the strong preying on the weak," he said, his eyes still on the fire. "It ain't right." His words were simple, but they struck a deep chord within her. It was not pity that drove him, but a profound, unshakable morality. He was helping her because he believed it was the right thing to do. In her world, where right and wrong were twisted by gossip and prejudice, such simple clarity was a revelation. Hours passed. The storm finally broke, the relentless drumming of the rain softening to a gentle patter. The worst was over. Elias rose to his feet, his large frame seeming to fill the small cabin. It was time for him to go. He walked to the door and pulled it open, a rush of cool, clean air filling the room. At the threshold, Clara reached out and touched his arm. It was a hesitant, feather-light touch, a desperate, unspoken plea for him not to go, not to leave her alone again. "No one has been kind to me in a very long time," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He stopped and looked down at her small, pale hand on his rough, wet sleeve. A powerful, protective urge washed over him, so fierce and so sudden it almost frightened him. He had spent 5 years shutting himself off from the world, and this one woman, with her quiet strength and her haunted eyes, was breaking through his defenses as surely as the flood had broken through the creek banks. Slowly, he raised his own hand and covered hers for a brief second. His touch was warm and solid, a silent acknowledgement, a promise. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night. Clara was left standing in the doorway, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. A single, fragile glimmer of hope was warring with the familiar fear in her heart. She realized, with a terrifying certainty, that Elias Thorne's kindness might be the thing that saved her, but it might also be the thing that brought down a wrath far worse than anything she had ever faced before. The fragile connection forged in the heart of the storm did not wither in the dry, cold weeks that followed. It deepened, quietly and cautiously, into a fragile routine. Elias Thorne found he had a remarkable number of reasons to be on the southern edge of his land. A fence post always seemed to be loose, a patch of scrub needed clearing, or a distant cougar track required investigation. Each task, legitimate in its own right, invariably ended with him riding toward Clara's homestead. He never arrived empty-handed. He brought her a side of venison one afternoon, slung over his saddle. "Shot more than I can use before it turns," he said, a gruff explanation that was not quite a lie. The offering was a practical one, meat for the coming winter, but it felt like something more. Another day. He looked up at the roof of her small cabin. His eyes narrowed against the glare of the autumn sun. "You will lose half your heat through those shingles come the first snow," he stated. The next morning, he was back with a bundle of fresh split cedar shingles and his tools. He worked with a quiet, solid competence that was a comforting presence in her chaotic life. She would bring him water, or a hot cup of weak tea, and they would talk. Each visit was framed by a practical purpose, a silent, unspoken agreement that allowed them to be near each other without having to name the powerful current of emotion that flowed between them. It was a language of gestures, of shared tasks and quiet understanding. Their conversations, once stilted and awkward, grew longer, more personal. In the lengthening shadows of the afternoons, they began to share the stories of their lives before Redemption Creek, sketching the outlines of the people they used to be. Clara spoke of her childhood in Ohio, of rolling green hills and a large, noisy family she could never return to. To them, she was the wife of Jedediah Thompson, and her widowhood was a shame they could not comprehend from 1,000 miles away. She hinted at the suffocating loneliness of her marriage, the cruelty that was not always visible in bruises, but was a constant presence in her life. She did not share the full horror of it, but Elias, a man well acquainted with trauma, heard the truth in the spaces between her words, in the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned her late husband's name. Elias, in turn, began to open up in ways he had not with another living soul in 5 years. He spoke of his father, a hard man who had taught him how to work the land, how to read the clouds for rain and the tracks in the dust for meaning. He talked about the dream he had once cherished, a dream of building a ranch that would last for generations, a place of substance and permanence in an unforgiving world. He spoke of the land itself with a deep, almost spiritual reverence that Clara understood completely. He still did not speak of Sarah and Daniel directly. He never said their names, but he would talk of a time before, and a shadow would pass over his eyes, so profound and so vast that Clara felt its chill. She began to see that his solitude was not born of a dislike for people, but of a loss so profound it had hollowed him out, behind the hardened, silent exterior. She saw the ghost of a loving, gentle man, a man who had once known how to laugh, and seeing that ghost made her heart ache. This new development did not escape the notice of Silas Blackwood. News traveled fast, and the sight of Elias Thorne's horse tied up outside Clara's cabin several times a week was the talk of the town, and, eventually, the entire valley. Blackwood was enraged. Elias Thorne was not some poor, defenseless woman he could easily intimidate. He was a respected, capable rancher, a man known for his skill with a rifle and his quiet, unshakable resolve. Blackwood saw Elias's protection of Clara as a direct, personal challenge to his authority, an act of defiance he could not tolerate. He called his foreman, Caleb, to his study. "Your gentle approach has failed," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously soft. "It seems you have only driven them closer together. It is time to escalate the harassment. I want her to know there is no safe place for her here. I want her to feel hunted." A quiet campaign of terror began. It started with small things. A shovel would go missing from Clara's shed, only to reappear a week later, broken and tossed in a ditch. Her water bucket, her lifeline, was found one morning at the bottom of her well, forcing her to spend hours trying to retrieve it with a makeshift hook. Each incident was designed to wear her down, to fray her nerves, to make her feel perpetually unsafe in her own home. Then came the warning she could not ignore. She woke one morning to a sound outside her door. When she opened it, a dead coyote lay on her doorstep, its throat cut, its blood a dark, frozen stain on the wooden planks. It was a clear and ugly message, a promise of death. That was the day Elias became her shadow, her guardian. He saw the coyote, and the cold, controlled fury in his eyes was more terrifying than any open rage. From that day on, he spent most of his waking hours at her property. He did not move in, but he was a constant presence. He would sit on her small porch, mending a bridle or slowly carving a piece of cottonwood with his knife, his rifle always leaning within arm's reach. He said nothing about his vigil, and she said nothing to acknowledge it, but they both understood. He was daring them to come back. His constant, watchful presence infuriated Blackwood's men and fueled the town's gossip into a wildfire of condemnation. The following Sunday, Preacher Albright delivered a thunderous sermon on the evils of temptation and the damnation that awaited keepers of sinful company, his gaze sweeping over his congregation, his meaning lost on no one. After that, Clara found herself completely shunned at the mercantile. Mr. Miller would serve her, but his eyes were cold, and other customers would turn their backs and walk away. She was no longer just an outcast. She was invisible, a ghost in her own town. The growing danger and the town's hostility forced Elias and Clara into an ever closer proximity, a small island of two against the world, and in that confined space, the unspoken attraction between them became an undeniable, palpable force. The air in the small cabin crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the threat from outside. A simple brush of their hands as she passed him a plate could feel like a brand. A shared glance across the dinner table could hold an entire conversation, as intimate and revealing as a touch. This intense, burgeoning desire was terrifying for both of them. For Clara, desire was tangled with the trauma of her marriage, with the memory of a man's touch meaning pain and violation. To feel this pull toward Elias felt like a betrayal of her own survival. For Elias, the feelings Clara stirred in him felt like a profound betrayal of his dead wife. The love he had for Sarah was a sacred, sealed-off part of his soul, and to feel it reawakening for another woman filled him with a deep and aching guilt. Winter arrived as it always did in Wyoming, with shocking speed and ferocity. One afternoon, Elias was at the cabin, delivering a final load of supplies he insisted she would need: more flour, salt, and coffee. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue an hour earlier, had turned to a flat, bruised gray. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. The first snowflakes began to fall, small and sparse at first, then thicker, faster, until they became a swirling, blinding maelstrom of white. A blizzard had descended upon the territory. "You cannot make it back," Clara said, her voice tight with worry as she looked out the window at the disappearing world. "You will be lost in minutes." Elias stood by the door, his hand on the latch, every instinct telling him to return to his own solitary fortress. But he looked at the fury of the storm, and then he looked at her, her face pale in the growing gloom of the cabin. He knew she was right. He nodded slowly. "Looks like I am staying." The world outside vanished. The wind shrieked like a banshee, throwing sheets of snow against the small cabin, which groaned and shuddered under the assault. They were completely isolated, two people adrift in a sea of white, cut off from the rest of the world. The forced intimacy of being snowed in for days on end broke down their final barriers. The cabin was small, and they were constantly, intensely aware of each other. They moved in a careful dance around the small space, the air thick with unspoken things. They fell into a shared routine dictated by survival. They conserved food, melted snow for water, and took turns feeding the fire, their only source of heat and light. During the day, they spoke little, but as night fell, with the blizzard raging outside and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, they would talk for hours. Their voices were low and confessional in the flickering light, the roar of the storm giving them a sense of privacy, as if their words would be swallowed up and carried away by the wind. It was on the third night that the conversation turned toward their deepest pains. They were sitting on the floor before the fire, sharing a meager meal of biscuits and dried beef. "You ever think about leaving?" Elias asked quietly, breaking a long silence. "Going somewhere else where they do not know you?" Clara stared into the flames. "There is nowhere to go," she whispered. "And even if there were, I would still bring myself with me." She looked at him, her eyes dark with a sorrow that seemed bottomless. "There are some things you cannot run from." She took a shuddering breath, and the story she had held inside for a year, the story that was poisoning her from the inside out, finally began to spill. "You know what they say about me?" she began, her voice barely audible over the storm. "About Jedediah. They are not wrong, not entirely." She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He came home that night. He was in a drunken rage. It was worse than ever before. He had been in town, and someone had said something. He was always angry. But that night, he was a devil." She paused, swallowing hard. "He had a poker in the fire. He used to threaten me with it. But that night, he pulled it out. It was glowing. He said he was going to put his mark on me, so no other man would ever look at me." Elias sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable in the flickering light, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I fought him," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "I do not know how. I was so scared. In the struggle, he was so drunk. He stumbled backward and fell, and his head struck the corner of the stone hearth." Her voice broke. He did not move. I just stood there. I did not push him. I swear to you, I did not. But I did not help him either. I just watched. I watched him die. And the first thing I felt, God forgive me, the first thing I felt was relief. It was so powerful it made me sick. I felt free, and I have been living with that ever since. The guilt of it, the fear that I am a monster, that some part of me was glad he was dead. She finished, weeping silently, tears tracking paths through the soot on her cheeks. She expected him to recoil in horror, to look at her with the same judgment as the rest of the town. But Elias did not move away. Instead, he leaned forward. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He reached out his rough, calloused hand and gently, so gently, touched a faint, silvery scar on her forearm that she always kept covered. His touch was not one of pity. It was a touch of profound, absolute understanding. He let his hand fall away and looked back into the fire. 5 years ago, he began, his voice a raw, gravelly whisper. I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, Daniel. He was 4. He spoke the names as if they were fragile glass, as if saying them aloud might shatter them. We had a small place, over in the next valley. We were happy. He took a long, ragged breath. There was a raid, outlaws. They wanted to drive the small ranchers out. I was out checking the far fences. I heard the shots. I ran, but I was too late. They had me pinned down behind some rocks. All I could do was listen. His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking apart. I could smell the smoke. They set the cabin on fire, and I could hear Sarah screaming. And then she stopped. I lay there in the dirt, helpless, listening to my whole world burn. My guilt is that I was not stronger. I was not faster. A better man would have found a way. A better man would have saved them. The confession hung in the air between them, a shared litany of pain, guilt, and loss. In that moment, they were no longer just a protector and a victim. They were 2 broken souls who understood the precise, terrible shape of each other's pain. The air in the small cabin was thick with their shared grief, with a desperate, unspoken desire, and with the first, fragile shoots of a love born in the darkest of places. Clara looked at him, tears streaming down her face. She saw past the stoic cowboy, past the hard, silent exterior, and saw a man drowning in a sorrow so deep it had almost swallowed him whole. You are a good man, Elias Thorne, she whispered, the words heartfelt and fierce. He turned from the fire and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her strength, her impossible resilience, the courage it took for her to survive, to confess, to simply exist. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Clara May, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Slowly, he moved closer. He raised his hand, the one that had touched her scar, and cupped her face. His palm was rough against her skin, but the gesture was infinitely tender. His thumb gently wiped a tear from her cheek, the pent-up emotion of the past months, the fear and the loneliness, the shared pain and the defiant hope, all culminated in that one moment. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was hungry and raw, a desperate, passionate kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and a fierce, burning need. It was a kiss of shared pain, of profound loneliness, and of a defiant, impossible hope for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a promise made without words, binding them together against the storm and against the world. The blizzard raged on, but inside the small cabin, by the light of the dying fire, they held each other close, having finally found a fragile sanctuary in each other's arms. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning, surrendering with a quiet, exhausted sigh. It left behind a world transformed, a landscape sculpted from pristine, unending white. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the air was so cold and still it felt as if the world was holding its breath. Underneath a thick blanket of snow, all the harsh edges of the land had been softened, all its imperfections buried. A profound silence had fallen, broken only by the soft thud of snow falling from a burdened pine branch. Inside the small cabin, the silence was of a different kind. It was not empty, but full of the weight of unspoken words, of confessions shared and barriers shattered. The isolation had irrevocably changed the dynamic between Elias and Clara. The physical and emotional intimacy they had shared in the heart of the storm had forged a bond that was now as real and solid as the frozen earth outside. They were no longer just allies thrown together by circumstance. They were two halves of a shared soul. They were in love, though the words themselves remained unspoken, too new, too fragile, and far too dangerous to say aloud. It took Elias the better part of the day to dig a path from the cabin door to the small lean-to where his horse had weathered the storm. Every scoop of the heavy, wet snow was a deliberate, physical act that felt like a countdown to a separation neither of them wanted. When the path was finally clear and Apollo was saddled, an awkward, painful silence fell between them. To leave felt like a betrayal, a tearing apart. "You will be careful," Clara said, her voice small. It was not a question. "Always," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of the ache in her own chest. He wanted to stay. She wanted to beg him to, but they both knew he could not yet. He mounted his horse, and without another word, rode away, his dark figure a stark contrast against the blinding white of the snow. Their new relationship was a secret they could not hope to keep in a place as small and watchful as Redemption Creek. A week later, when Elias was forced to ride into town for supplies he could not do without, the change in him was subtle, but to eyes sharpened by gossip and suspicion, it was unmistakable. The permanent shadow of grief in his eyes had not vanished, but it had been tempered by a new light, a new focus. There was a purpose in his stride that had not been there before. He still did not smile, but the hard, defensive set of his jaw had softened. The town noticed when his wagon was seen at Clara's homestead twice more in the following weeks. The town's whispers turned into a cold, hard certainty. His regular presence was no longer seen as an act of misplaced charity. It was a flagrant transgression, an open defiance of their judgment. The town's scorn, once directed solely at Clara, now fell on both of them with absolute finality. They were partners in sin, and Redemption Creek turned its collective back on them. Word of this, like all things in the valley, eventually reached Silas Blackwood. He sat in his leather armchair, a map of his vast holdings spread on the desk before him, and listened to his foreman, Caleb, deliver the news. Blackwood's face, usually a mask of controlled affability, hardened into something cold and dangerous. His campaign of minor intimidation had failed. Worse, it had backfired, pushing his two problems together, forging an alliance he had not anticipated. He was a man who could not tolerate defiance. The land, the water, the town, they were all pieces on his board, to be moved and controlled as he saw fit. Clara Thompson was a recalcitrant pawn, but Elias Thorne? Elias was an opposing player. His quiet, steadfast protection of the woman was a personal affront, a challenge to Blackwood's absolute authority. He realized then that he needed to remove one of them from the equation permanently. He needed to break them so completely that they would never dare to oppose him again. And he knew, with a predator's instinct, exactly where Elias Thorne's weakness lay. It lay in the past, in a burned-out cabin and a night of screams. Blackwood reached out to a band of ruthless outlaws he kept on his payroll for work that required a crueler touch than even Caleb could provide. They were led by a man named Finn, a wiry, cold-eyed man with a scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. They were the same men Blackwood had used for dirty work before, the same men who, 5 years earlier, had conducted a raid on a small settlement in a neighboring valley Blackwood had coveted. A raid that had left several homesteaders dead, including a young woman and her child. Blackwood's instructions were precise. He did not want Clara Thompson killed. A dead body would bring U.S. Marshals and questions he did not want to answer. He wanted her broken. He wanted her driven out, her spirit shattered, her will to fight extinguished, and he wanted Elias Thorne to suffer the exquisite agony of another failure, another loss. He wanted him to watch it happen all over again. The attack came on a bitterly cold night. 2 weeks later, the sky was a starless, ink-black canvas, the only light a cruel sliver of a new moon. Elias had just left Clara's cabin. They had fallen into a new routine where he would spend the evenings with her, sharing a meal, ensuring she was safe, before riding back to his own ranch for the night. It was a compromise, a way to be together without fully abandoning the lives they had built separately. The outlaws, hidden in the pines on a nearby ridge, had been watching this routine for 3 nights. They had been waiting for this exact moment. As the sound of Elias's horse faded into the distance, they descended. Clara was alone, washing the few dishes from their supper. She heard the horses first, the muffled drumming of hooves on the frozen ground. Too many and too close. A spike of pure animal fear shot through her. She ran to the door, fumbling with the heavy bar, but she was too late. The door splintered inward, ripped from its leather hinges with a single, violent kick. 3 masked men burst into the small cabin. They did not speak. They moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, their sole purpose to destroy. One man swept the plates from the table, shattering them on the floor. Another overturned the bed, tearing the mattress apart with a long knife. They moved through the small space like a whirlwind of mindless violence, smashing her furniture, shattering the small, hand-painted vase that had been her mother's, the only precious item she had left from her life before. The third man found the neat stack of mending she worked on for her meager income and tore the finely stitched shirts to shreds. The violence was not random. It was personal, intimate, and violating. One of the men, the largest of the 3, grabbed her, his hand closing around her upper arm like a vice. She fought back with a ferocity that surprised them, kicking and scratching, her terror transmuting into pure rage. But she was no match for his strength. He overpowered her easily, his foul breath hot on her face as he dragged her outside and threw her into the snow. The leader, Finn, stepped out of the shadows. He pulled down his bandana, revealing the scarred sneer. "This is your final warning from Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This land is his. Get out, or the next time we will not leave you breathing." While he spoke, the other 2 men were dousing the side of the cabin with kerosene. The sharp, oily smell filled the frigid air, a scent of pure menace. It was the same smell that haunted Elias Thorne's nightmares. Elias was halfway back to his ranch when the feeling hit him. It was not a thought, but a physical sensation, a gut-wrenching certainty that something was terribly wrong. It was a cold dread that started in the pit of his stomach and spread through his veins like ice water, an instinct honed by the sharpest edge of trauma. He knew that feeling. He had felt it once before. Without a moment of hesitation, he wheeled Apollo around, sinking his heels into the horse's flanks. He rode back at a frantic, desperate gallop, his heart pounding in his throat. As he crested the last ridge overlooking her property, he saw it. A flicker of orange against the dark wood of her cabin. A hungry, growing flame licking at the night sky. The sight, a burning home against the darkness, the echo of his past made terrifyingly real, tore a sound from the depths of his soul. It was a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated fury and terror. He arrived as the outlaws were mounting their horses, their dark work done, leaving the fire to consume the small cabin, fueled by a cold, precise rage. Elias drew his Colt pistol. The night exploded into a chaotic flurry of gunshots and shouting. He was outnumbered, but he was also a man possessed. a desperate, protective fury guiding his aim. A bullet from his gun caught one of the outlaws in the leg, sending the man screaming from his saddle. The others returned fire, bullets whistling past Elias's head. Finn, seeing that the fight was lost, spurred his horse toward the darkness of the trees. But before he vanished, he turned in his saddle, raised his pistol one last time, and took a parting shot. The bullet was not meant for Elias. It was meant for the source of all his trouble. It crossed the moonlit snow and found Clara, who was struggling to her feet, her mind numb with shock and horror. She crumpled to the ground with a sharp cry of pain, her dark dress a stark contrast to the white snow. The remaining outlaws vanished into the night. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle and roar of the fire and the pained whimpering from the snow. Elias ran to her side, his heart seizing in his chest with a terror that eclipsed even his rage. She was bleeding badly from a wound in her shoulder, her face ghostly pale against the snow, which was already beginning to turn a dark, glistening red around her. He scooped her into his arms and carried her away from the burning cabin, away from the intense, suffocating heat. The fire was engulfing the small structure now, a monstrous, living thing consuming the fragile life she had built, devouring her past and her present. All she could do was watch it burn, her body racked with shudders of pain and shock. Elias frantically worked to stop the bleeding, tearing a long strip from the bottom of his own shirt and pressing it hard against the wound. And as he held her, trying to keep her conscious, the trauma of his past came crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. The smell of the smoke, the sight of the flames, the feel of someone he loved bleeding in his arms. It was happening all over again. He was back in that other night, helpless, a failure, while the world burned around him. Clara, delirious with pain, looked up at his face. She saw the absolute agony in his eyes, the raw horror, and in her panicked state, she mistook his trauma for regret. She thought he was seeing the cost of helping her, the ruin she had brought upon him. She thought he was going to leave her. She clutched at the front of his shirt with her good hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Her voice was a ragged, desperate pant, the words torn from the very depths of her soul. "Please," she gasped, her eyes pleading with him. "Please do not leave me broken." Her plea, her voice, her name for the very thing he feared he was, cut through the paralyzing fog of his grief like a shard of glass. This was not Sarah. This was not that night 5 years ago. This was Clara. Here, now, and she needed him. He looked down at her, his face a mask of anguish and a new, terrible determination. The past fell away, burned to ash by the intensity of the present moment. "I am not leaving you," he said, his voice raw with an emotion so powerful it shook his entire body. "I am never leaving you." He lifted her gently onto his horse, swinging up into the saddle behind her, holding her securely against his chest, with her home and her life burning to embers behind them. He turned Apollo toward the safety of his own ranch and rode into the cold, dark night. A grim, unshakable vow was forming in his heart, a promise forged in fire and blood. This time, he would not just grieve. This time, he would have justice. The ride to Elias Thorne's ranch was a desperate, nightmarish journey through a frozen, moonless world. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body a dead weight against his chest, her only anchor the constant, low murmur of his voice in her ear. He spoke to her without pause, telling her about the stars, about the feel of the cold air, about the steady gait of his horse. He was not just talking to her. He was pouring his own strength into her, a lifeline of sound in the overwhelming darkness, willing her to hold on. All the while, his hand was pressed hard against the makeshift bandage on her shoulder, a futile, desperate attempt to hold her lifeblood within her. He brought her to a place that had, for 5 long years, been a monument to his grief. His home was not a cabin, but a small, sturdy house built of thick pine logs, a testament to a future he had once believed in. Inside, It was silent and meticulously clean, but it was a sterile cleanliness, the order of a place devoid of life and laughter. Dust did not dare to settle on the simple, hand-crafted furniture. The floors were swept. The hearth was cold. The air was still. It was a tomb, a place where a man's heart had been laid to rest. Now, in an instant, it was filled with a frantic, desperate purpose. It became a sanctuary and a sick room. He laid her gently on his own bed, the first person other than himself to touch its sheets in half a decade. He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it roared to life, chasing the chill from the room. He lit every lamp he owned, flooding the space with a warm, steady light, a defiant stand against the darkness that threatened to claim her. He proved to be surprisingly adept at tending to her wound. His hands, though rough and calloused from years of ranch work, were steady and gentle as he cut away the blood-soaked fabric of her dress. He had experience, learned in the brutal triage of an army field hospital, and honed by years of patching up injured ranch hands and animals. He cleaned the angry, torn flesh with whiskey that made her cry out in her delirium, his own face a mask of stone. Then, with a needle and thread he had sterilized in the boiling water over the fire, he crudely but effectively stitched the wound closed. For the next 48 hours, he did not sleep. He sat in a wooden chair by her bedside, a constant, unmoving vigil. He fought the fever that racked her body, a fiery poison that threatened to burn her away from the inside out. He bathed her face and neck with cool water, his touch careful and reverent. He brewed a thin, nourishing broth and, when she could not take it herself, gently forced it between her parched lips, a spoonful at a time. He never left her side, his presence a solid, unwavering shield against the death that lingered in the shadows of the room. During the long hours of the nights, as the fever raged, Clara drifted through the haunted landscapes of her past. She murmured fragmented memories, her voice thin and reedy. She spoke to her long-dead mother, relived moments of sheer terror from her marriage to Jedediah, his name a guttural sound of fear on her lips. She cried out as she felt the heat of the phantom poker, and she flinched from the memory of the masked men who had destroyed her home. Elias sat in the quiet lamplight and listened to the raw, unfiltered pain in her voice. Every broken word, every terrified gasp, was like a hammer blow against his own heart, chipping away the last of the scar tissue that had protected it. He listened, and his resolve, his grim vow for justice, solidified from a burning ember into something as hard and unyielding as granite. He was no longer just a man in love, trying to protect the woman who had brought him back to life. He was an instrument of vengeance. He saw Silas Blackwood's hand in the attack as clearly as if the man had signed his name in the snow outside her burning cabin. The similarity to the raid that had destroyed his own family, the calculated cruelty, the use of fire, the goal of driving someone from their land, was too stark, too precise to be a coincidence. This was not just an attack on Clara, it was a message for him. Clara's recovery was slow and agonizingly painful. On the third day, the fever broke. She awoke not to the terrifying haze of delirium, but to the quiet, sunlit reality of Elias's home. She found herself in his bed, her shoulder tightly bandaged, the air smelling of wood smoke and coffee. She saw him asleep in the chair beside her, his head slumped against his chest, his face etched with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to be carved into his very bones. In that moment, seeing the toll his vigil had taken on him, a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. The period of her convalescence was one of profound and unexpected intimacy, as she slowly regained her strength. He cared for her every need with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He helped her sit up, his hands strong and sure. He cooked for her, simple meals of stew and biscuits that tasted like the finest food she had ever eaten. One evening, when she was still too weak to do it herself, He sat on the edge of the bed and gently brushed the tangles from her long hair. The simple, domestic act was so full of gentle care, so far removed from the brutal realities of their lives, that it broke down the last of her emotional walls. This complete physical vulnerability, the act of placing her life entirely in his hands, allowed her to see the man he truly was, the man he had been before the world had broken him. She saw the deep, unwavering tenderness he was capable of, and he, in turn, allowed himself to care for someone again, to feel the terrifying, wonderful weight of another person's life in his hands. He was not just saving her body, she was healing his soul. In the quiet days that followed, their love was finally spoken aloud. One afternoon, the winter sun was streaming through the window, laying a warm patch of light on the wooden floor. He was helping her to a chair by the fire, her steps still unsteady. She stopped and looked up at him, her eyes clear and filled with an emotion that needed no words. "You saved my life, Elias," she said, her voice soft but strong. He looked down at her, his rugged face softening. His voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "You saved mine first, Clara May." It was the simplest of truths, but it held the weight of everything they had endured. He had been a ghost, a man walking through the motions of living, and she, with her quiet strength and her defiant heart, had brought him back. She had given him a reason to fight, a reason to feel again. He leaned down, and she reached up, and they kissed. It was not like the desperate, hungry kiss in the storm. This was a kiss of quiet certainty, of profound gratitude and a deep, abiding love. It was a vow made in the quiet of a sick room, a silent promise to build a future out of the ashes of their pasts. As Clara's strength returned, a new energy began to burn in Elias. His grief had been a passive, heavy thing. His quest for justice was active, sharp, and focused. He knew he could not go to Sheriff Brody in Redemption Creek. The man was little more than Blackwood's pawn. If he was to have justice, he would have to get it himself. He needed proof, something undeniable that would tear down the wall of fear and influence that protected Blackwood. He started by returning to the scene of the crime. The charred ruins of Clara's cabin were a black, ugly wound on the snow-covered landscape. The smell of smoke and ash still hung heavy in the cold air. He walked through the debris, his eyes scanning every inch of the ground. It was in the churned-up snow near where the gunfight had happened that he found it, a small, circular piece of metal, tarnished but still gleaming faintly in the weak sun. It was a concho, a piece of silver handcrafted to adorn a saddle, decorated with a unique pattern of a striking rattlesnake. It was a small thing, but it was tangible. It was a start. He knew he could not take on Blackwood alone at his fortified ranch, surrounded by loyal men. He needed to isolate him, to strip away his power base. His strategy became two-pronged: find the outlaws who wore the serpent concho and expose Blackwood's corruption to the town he ruled. He began to discreetly ask questions in the saloons of neighboring towns, places where he was known only as a quiet, serious rancher who kept to himself. He never asked about Blackwood directly. He listened more than he talked, buying a whiskey he barely touched, his ears open for any whispers about a gang of hard men led by a man named Finn, a gang known for riding saddles with distinctive silverwork. Simultaneously, he began to work on the second part of his plan. He knew there had to be other ranchers, other homesteaders, that Blackwood had bullied and cheated over the years. He sought out an old rancher named Henderson, a man whose weary face he remembered from the mercantile. Henderson had lost his prime grazing land to Blackwood a few years back in a card game that had always smelled crooked. At first, Henderson was too afraid to talk. Blackwood's reach was long, and his memory for slights was even longer. But Elias did not press. He simply sat with the old man, sharing a cup of coffee, and spoke of his own troubles with Blackwood, his quiet conviction, and the grievance they now shared. Slowly won Henderson's trust. The old man's stories began to trickle out. Tales of Blackwood's ruthlessness, of forged documents, violent intimidation, and a sheriff who always looked the other way. The turning point in his search for the outlaws came nearly 2 weeks later. He had been following a trail of rumors about a man who had been shot in the leg and was seeking quiet medical help. The trail led him to a small, dusty town 2 days' ride away, and to a doctor with weary eyes and a stained waistcoat. The doctor, seeing the look in Elias's eyes, and perhaps possessing his own dislike for men like Finn, admitted to treating the outlaw. The man had died of infection 3 days later. His partners were here to collect his body, the doctor said, wiping his spectacles. Grumbling the whole time, said the pay was not worth the trouble for a simple job of scaring a woman near Redemption Creek. The doctor paused. One of them, a man with a scarred face, rode a fine saddle, had these fancy silver conchos on it, looked like coiled snakes. Elias's blood ran cold. He now had a name, Finn, and a direct link between the concho he had found and the attack. He learned from the doctor the general direction the gang had headed, into the Badlands, a maze of canyons and rock formations where the law rarely ventured. He knew they would have a hideout there. He now had his target. He prepared for a confrontation, but he knew that riding in with his guns blazing was a fool's errand. He needed one of them alive. He needed a confession that would nail Blackwood to the wall. Before he left, he stood with Clara in the main room of his house. She was able to walk on her own now, though she was still pale, and a weariness clung to her. She knew where he was going, and what he intended to do. The terror in her eyes was a sharp, physical pain in his chest. "Do not go, Elias," she begged, her hands clutching his arms. "It is too dangerous. What if you do not come back? I cannot lose you. I cannot be alone again." He held her close, pressing his face into her hair, breathing in her scent. He held her for a long moment, simply feeling the warmth and life of her in his arms. "This is the only way. Clara," he said gently, pulling back to look her in the eyes, "this is the only way we can ever be safe. The only way we can build a life without constantly looking over our shoulder. Blackwood will not stop until he has what he wants, or until he is stopped for good." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "I spent 5 years running from a ghost. I am done running. I am not just doing this for what I lost," he told her, his voice raw with conviction. "I am doing this for what we have found." It was a promise for their future, a future that was hanging precariously in the balance. The next morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, Elias rode out from his ranch. He was a lone figure heading toward the dangerous, sun-baked canyons of the Badlands, the fate of his and Clara's hard-won love resting entirely on his shoulders. The Badlands were a raw, skeletal landscape, a maze of sun-baked canyons and wind-scoured rock formations that the earth itself seemed to have forgotten. It was a place where a man could disappear, and for 2 days, that is precisely what Elias did. He moved through the hostile terrain with the quiet patience of a hunter, his army scouting skills serving him well. He followed the trail the doctor had given him, a path marked by subtle signs, a broken branch, a scuffed rock, the day-old droppings of shod horses, until he found them. Their hideout was a network of shallow caves carved into the base of a sheer canyon wall, a natural fortress with a clear view of the only approach, from a high, hidden vantage point. Elias observed them for a full day, his body pressed flat against the cold rock. He learned their routines, their numbers, their habits. There were 4 of them left, including their scarred leader, Finn. He watched them eat, argue, and clean their weapons. He noted their carelessness, the arrogance of men who believed they were untouchable in their desolate kingdom. And he identified his target, the youngest of the gang, a boy of no more than 18 with a nervous energy that set him apart from the others. He was the weak link. Elias decided then that a full-scale assault would be a fool's errand. He needed to isolate one, not fight them all. The next afternoon, he put his plan into motion. He climbed high on the canyon wall opposite the caves, to a place where a section of the cliff face was unstable. a jumble of loose rock and scree held in a precarious balance. Using a long, sturdy branch as a lever, he put all his weight into dislodging the keystone rock. With a great groan, the rock slide began. It started as a trickle, then became a roar, an avalanche of stone and dust thundering down into the far end of the canyon. The effect on the outlaws' camp was instantaneous. The men scrambled from their caves, grabbing rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Finn shouted orders, sending the youngest member, the boy Elias had been watching, to ride out and investigate the source of the noise. It was the moment Elias had been waiting for. He circled around, his movements swift and silent, and intercepted the boy in a narrow wash far from the camp. The capture was swift and brutal. Elias came upon him from the side, pulling him from his horse before the boy even had a chance to cry out. He disarmed him and had him bound before the dust from the rock slide had fully settled. He dragged the terrified outlaw deeper into the maze of canyons, far from any chance of rescue. Elias did not use torture. He did not need to. He used a cold, relentless psychological pressure that was far more effective. He let the boy sit in his fear for an hour before he even spoke. "Your friends are not coming for you," Elias said, his voice a low, flat monotone. "They probably think the rock slide got you. It is cleaner that way. One less man to split the pay with." "They will come," the boy stammered, his face pale, his bravado gone. "Even if they did, what do you think they would do?" Elias continued, ignoring him. "Finn knows you are a liability. So does the man who pays him, a man named Blackwood. He cannot afford any loose ends. He will surely have you killed to keep you silent. Your only chance of seeing another sunrise is me." Elias then reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver concho. He tossed it onto the ground in front of the boy. The rattlesnake emblem seemed to glitter with a life of its own in the fading light. "I found this at the cabin you burned, the woman's cabin." The boy's eyes widened in terror. Seeing the proof, understanding that he was caught, and faced with the terrifying logic of Elias's words, he broke. The story came pouring out in a torrent of desperate, fearful words. He confessed to everything. He told Elias how Silas Blackwood had hired them for the raid on Clara's cabin, with specific instructions to terrorize and destroy, but not to kill. And then came the words that stopped Elias's heart. "He has used us before," the boy whimpered. "Same kind of job, years ago, in the valley north of here. Burned out some small ranchers so he could take their land. Finn said it was our first job for him, the one where we killed that woman and her kid." The confession was a physical blow, a gut punch that stole the air from Elias's lungs. For 5 years, his grief had been a shapeless, monstrous thing, the result of random, faceless evil. Now, it had a name. All of his pain, his past and his present, the ghosts of Sarah and Daniel and the fresh wounds of Clara, were all connected by a single, dark thread leading directly back to one man, Silas Blackwood. A cold, clarifying rage settled over him, burning away any remaining doubt or hesitation. With his witness secured, Elias tied the boy securely, gagged him, and left him hidden in a small cave, promising to send the U.S. Marshals for him if he cooperated fully. He then rode back to Redemption Creek, not as a vigilante seeking blood, but as a man armed with the terrible, righteous power of the truth. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He did not confront Caleb. He took a room at the livery, tended to his horse, and he waited. He waited for Sunday morning. The final confrontation took place in the center of town. The church bell was ringing, its clear, solemn tones calling the good people of Redemption Creek to worship. Families in their Sunday best were strolling down the dusty main street, greeting each other with pious nods. On the steps of the whitewashed church, Silas Blackwood stood like a king holding court, dressed in a fine black suit. He shook hands with the town's elite, his face a mask of civic virtue and benevolence. It was into this scene of peaceful hypocrisy that Elias Thorne rode. He came down the main street at a slow, deliberate walk, his expression grim and unyielding. He was not alone. He was leading a second horse, and seated upon it, wrapped in a thick blanket, was Clara. She was still pale, her arm in a sling, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. She met the stunned, gaping stares of the townspeople with a quiet, defiant dignity. Elias stopped his horse directly in front of the church, blocking the entrance. A silent, unavoidable challenge. The crowd fell silent, the air crackling with a sudden, palpable tension. Silas Blackwood's smile faltered. "Thorn," he said, his voice tight. "This is hardly the time or place for—" "This is the only time and the only place." Elias cut him off, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent street. He looked not at Blackwood, but at the assembled townspeople. "For a year, you have condemned this woman on the word of rumor and prejudice. Now you will hear the truth." In that clear, unwavering voice, Elias laid out his accusation. He told the story of the attack on Clara, of the destruction of her home, of the bullet that had nearly taken her life. He held up the silver concho for all to see. This was dropped by one of the men who did it, a man who confessed that he and his gang were hired by Silas Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood's face turned a mottled red. "This is an outrage! The man is crazed!" But Elias was not finished. He turned his cold, gray eyes directly on Blackwood. "The boy also confessed to another job you hired them for. Blackwood, 5 years ago. A raid on the homesteaders in the North Valley." Elias's voice dropped, becoming thick with a grief and rage that was terrifying in its control. "You hired them to burn out a family. My family. You murdered my wife, Sarah, and my son, Daniel, for a piece of land." The town was stunned into absolute silence. The accusation was so monstrous, so direct, that no one dared to breathe. Blackwood, for a moment, was speechless. Then he tried to laugh it off, a harsh, ugly sound. "The man is mad with grief, and this woman," he sneered, gesturing at Clara, "is a lying fallen woman who would say anything to save her own skin." But Elias's conviction was a solid, unshakable wall. And then a voice came from the crowd. It was the old rancher, Henderson. His voice trembled, but it was firm. "He is not lying," Henderson said, stepping forward. "Blackwood stole my land with forged papers and a threat against my family. He is a thief and a bully." It was as if a dam had broken, one by one. Other townspeople who had been silently victimized by Blackwood for years found their courage. A shopkeeper spoke of threats and protection money. A widow spoke of a loan called in at an impossible time. The foundation of Blackwood's power, the town's fear and its silence, crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. Blackwood, seeing his empire, his entire world, collapsing around him, panicked, his mask of civility shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. With a snarl, he drew a small, concealed pistol from his coat pocket. But Elias was ready. He had been waiting for this. His own hand moved in a blur, drawing the Colt from the holster on his hip. The shootout was not a prolonged battle. It was a swift, decisive end to a long and painful struggle. Elias was faster, his movements fueled by years of grief and a righteous, burning certainty. A single shot rang out, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. Blackwood staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before he crumpled and fell dead on the steps of the very church he had pretended to honor. His foreman, Caleb, made a move to intervene, but he was quickly subdued, overwhelmed by a dozen pairs of hands from the now emboldened townspeople. Justice, raw and final and bloody, had at last come to Redemption Creek. The aftermath was quiet and somber. The U.S. Marshals were called in from Cheyenne. Elias's testimony, combined with the full confession of the captured outlaw and the corroborating stories of half the town, exposed the depth of Blackwood's corruption. The town, in turn, had to reckon with its own complicity. its willingness to follow a powerful man and its cruel prejudice against a lone, vulnerable woman. The shunning and the whispers finally died, replaced by a quiet, shame-faced respect for the woman who had endured so much. Spring came to the territory, and with it, a time of healing and rebuilding. The snow melted, and the vast plains, once brown and dormant, were covered in a carpet of new green grass and a riot of wildflowers. Elias and Clara worked together, not on her ruined property, but on his ranch. They were building an extension to his house, a new room that caught the morning sun. They worked side by side, their movements in an easy, unspoken harmony. He would lift the heavy logs, and she would be there with the chinking. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or awkwardness, but of a deep, abiding comfort and understanding. One warm afternoon, Elias took Clara by the hand and led her to a quiet spot on his land, under the shade of a large, old cottonwood tree. There, 2 simple wooden markers stood, weathered by 5 years of sun and snow. It was the first time he had brought anyone to this place. He told her stories about them, about Sarah's easy laugh and the way she loved the wildflowers, about Daniel's fascination with grasshoppers and the sound of his giggle. He spoke not with the sharp, tearing pain of before, but with a gentle, sad fondness. He was not replacing his past. He was making peace with it, weaving it into the fabric of his new life. Clara stood with him, her hand held firmly in his, sharing his burden and his memory, her presence a silent promise that he would never have to carry it alone again. The story ends on a simple, powerful image. They are sitting together on the porch of their growing home as the sun sets, painting the vast Wyoming sky in brilliant, breathtaking colors. The landscape is still vast and wild, but it no longer feels empty or threatening. It feels like a promise. Elias's rough, scarred hands are holding Clara's. These are the hands that fought for her, that tended her wounds, and that are now, day by day, building their future. They are both scarred. Both have known tragedy so profound it would have broken lesser people. But they are not broken. They have found in each other a love that is stronger than prejudice, more resilient than tragedy, and as vast and enduring as the western sky. They have a quiet, hard-won peace, a glimmer of hope that has fought through the darkest of nights and has finally, gloriously, blossomed into a new life. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.